Over the last weeks, we see a tremendous tension escalating because of various events and incidents. We're talking about targeted Iranian and Syrian bases that belong to the Iranians in Syria. We're talking about Assad's chemical attack, which just brought about escalation in the tension between the United States and Russia. So we've reached a new crossroads because we're awaiting President Trump's declaration, and there in the Gaza Strip we see it spiraling towards the Nakba Commemoration Day and the move of the American embassy to Jerusalem, the Palestinians have vehemently objected to, and the Ramadan month, which is always considered an extremely vulnerable, sensitive month from a security point of view. There are many interpreters who try and sort of say, calm down, no one wants to reach full-out war. But we've seen that escalation can bring out a situation of war even if they did not intend to. Today, we have two previous former ministries of defense, Moshe Arens, who was 3 times Minister of Defense between 83, 84 in the State of Israel, and then from 90 to 92 during the Gulf War, and in 1999, and Lieutenant General, the 17th Chief of General Staff in the State of Israel, Bogie between 2013 and 2016, here seated with us. Professor Arens, what in your assessment are the main threats against the State of Israel in its 70th year since its inception? Well, its central threat, the immediate one, emanates from Iran and from the Hezbollah, and Assad in Syria too. And basically it is manifest through the threat of missiles. These proxies have these threatening us, and you don't need airports in order to launch them. You can launch them from mobile launch pads. You can locate them in towns, urban areas, so it's very difficult to identify them. And here we're talking about 100,000 and more missiles from Lebanon and other places. We're trying to build some kind of parallel, improved even, base to launch them from in Syria. And of course, this in itself is really our home front threat. The civilian population of Israel is encroached upon and threatened. We're talking about our infrastructure, precision-guided missiles now are involved in that. And with this current technology, it is not difficult to turn rockets into precision-guided missiles that are capable of pinpointing targets, including military targets. And that is the threat that we must grapple with, and as quickly as possible. Thank you very much, Professor Arens. Lieutenant General Ya'alon, how do you see what these main threats are to the IDF at the moment? Well, before we talk about the IDF, I think that our strategic challenge of the State of Israel, even in its 70th year of independence, is still the refusal of so many in the Middle East to actually refuse to deny our existence and our right of existence as a Jewish people here. So the Iranian example is excellent here. We don't even have a border with Iran. We haven't conquered or occupied any territory, and they want to eradicate us and wipe us off the map. So if we talk about this, there's a tremendous quarrel and dispute all around the world, and here as well, whether that is the challenge or are there people who have actually sort of basically agreed and accepted our existence. So if we're talking about the dominant party, is Iran, because their whole approach is religious and strategic, that they want a Shiite hegemony here, and basically in their eyes we're simply stuck here, this Jewish entity, so for that they're willing to sacrifice a great deal in order to reach a situation where we can be wiped off, and that could actually be through attrition. So, for example, if the Hezbollah or the Hamas or someone else carry out horrific terror attacks or a missile every day, that's another way of affecting and harming us. Undoubtedly, Iran is the least stabilizing entity. I mean, the fact that they're Sunni, I mean, they don't even have any connection with us, and they're activating proxies against us. Saudi Arabia is also subversed basically by the Houthis and others. But this is really, I mean, if we're talking about our allies, the United States, they agree with us that that is the challenge, and only then will people really reach an understanding. Well, this is translated into military terms and military concepts. Undoubtedly, IDF has proven capability that no hostile entity against us, including the Iranians, do not dare sort of throw a gauntlet of challenge against us. But they have come, some of them, to the conclusion that they have to sign accords with us. Only a few have, and the others have signed various non-proliferation agreements, non-nuclear agreements. But our number one threat at the moment is Iran, and that is the main issue. And we undoubtedly need to reach a situation where the Iranians do not have a nuclear military capability, and the army has to contend with the threat which is now on the horizon. That is, of course, the missiles and the terror threat. In other words, not allowing the IDF to actually be able to use its force, but rather sort of hit out at its soft belly, at the civilian population. And of course, this is connected to things that are happening every single day. And in other words, this is called the campaign between campaigns. The army must continue running smoothly. Be prepared the whole time for the next round, the next campaign, and the next war will be postponed as much as possible. And the fact is that we've been doing that for quite a significant period of time in the Gaza Strip and in the West Bank. I mean, the moment someone tries to shoot at us, then immediately there are steps taken that, let's call them, using the stick properly and using the carrots properly in order to distance us from the next round. This, of course, obligates us to have an intelligence supremacy and a supremacy in what we call the IT or the C5. In other words, we talk about control, communication, cyber, information systems, etc. And of course, very precise fire precision, which is something, and all that emanates from these capabilities. So, of course, these challenges is what the army has to be ready for. Professor Arens, you mentioned the rocket and missile threat that is focused on the home front, which is the main threat against the state of Israel. Perhaps in a historical perspective, you were the Minister of Defense during the Gulf War, wherein for the first time a remote foe or country, if you actually create an analogy here, analogy to the actual Iranians. Now, from a historical perspective, what were the lessons learned then, and where do we stand with that today? I think that the lessons learned that one have to conclude and learned from this danger of rockets and missiles that are launched remotely should have been actually concluded and learned many years before that, because these barrages and attacks on the home front from ranges far and beyond our country, Katyushas, Scuds, they were already taking place in the 70s. And I tend to think that for quite a time now, we never really perceived it as a real, tangible threat. First of all, because missiles and ballistic missiles, that's how the Germans started in the Second World War with a V2. When they were carrying out the Blitz on London, there was no way of intercepting them. They just had to, unfortunately, absorb them until you could actually reach out to the actual bases that they were being launched from. That was something of the past, one would think. But the Germans knew how to develop it. And here, within a number of years, we're talking about a relatively inexpensive arm that anyone can actually access. Hamas, Hezbollah, terrorists. And they encroach upon the security of the home front. So in the 80s, we envisioned this threat as something very tangible against the northern front of Israel. One couldn't say that it wasn't terrible. It was dangerous, but it was something that was relatively restricted, limited, wherein the solution that we tried to reach, and that was before we developed that capability of intercepting such missiles, was to actually have boots on the ground and go into the field and therefore distance this threat. But the missiles have been developed and the ranges have developed and been extended. I mean, if you're talking about the Iraqis and the Iranian war, you can see how they managed to attack each other. Tremendous ranges and distances. So I tend to think that it took us too much time, too long to understand the order of magnitude of this risk. There were periods during the days of the Kadesh campaign and Ben Gurion that the first concern was to defend and protect the civilian population. But Ben Gurion wasn't willing to start with the Kadesh campaign unless the French Air Force, because we didn't have an Air Force in those days that was actually appropriate, that the Air Force in France would protect us. But now the civilian population is not ensured, it is not protected, not only in the northern enclave of Israel, but in a much greater sort of strip and enclave in the south. It's in fact the entire state of Israel. We're talking about, if you look at the skyline in Tel Aviv and the amazing development in this country from an industrial point of view, everything is exposed from the northern tip to the most southern tip. From a period wherein we thought that the only way of reacting to that would be deterrence, within a very short period of time, in fact, we understood that deterrence works in both directions. And of course, we have to say the truth as it is. The 100,000 missiles in the hands of the Hezbollah and in Syria now, they also deter us. So it's a kind of reciprocal deterrence, and who deters who? The Hezbollah. It's not an army, by the way. It's not a state army. It's not the German army of the Second World War. But their capability of hitting out at all our civilian population, of course, does deter us and makes us somewhat reticent. So, of course, this whole issue of being able to intercept them with the Iron Dome and the Chetz, the Arrow one, and other sort of intermediary levels of deterrence. But please do not delude yourself. It's not a kind of umbrella that is open above us and we can walk between the raindrops and everything will be fine. Some will permeate and drop through. And therefore, we live with this danger. And over the last 2 years, we have taken correct tactical steps wherein we act in order to try and strengthen and reinforce this. We're willing to actually work actively in the in Syrian skies as well, because it's dangerous, very dangerous. We understand how dangerous it is, but we're willing to take these steps. And yes, it was correctly said that the tangible danger, immediate danger, short term, the Iranians, by the way, are backing these proxies. It's not the nuclear that in itself. Nuclear Iran is definitely a problem, but before that, we're talking about the simpler arms and weapons, the missiles. So what we're doing nowadays, which should have been done many a year ago, is we should have wiped it out before it actually expanded and grew up. We should have wiped it out when it was small. So the way we have to grapple with this risk, yes, there's a deterrence element, but this works in both ways, both directions. In other words, our capability to intercept missiles, every time there's an alarm that goes off, then if people go into their shelters. They do trust the Iron Dome system. And if it's a massive barrage, then they actually close the schools down for those days. So we do trust and rely on the Iron Dome and the other capability of intercepting, especially on our intelligence directorate, because we have to know where is it coming from, and so that at the D moment, the D-Day, we will be able to really zoom in and home in and know where it's coming from. Thank you very much, Professor Arens. Lieutenant General, Alon, you spoke and expanded on that threat, and I remember that spider web speech of Hassan Nasrallah that is sort of renowned. Where do we stand? Should we be exposed to that threat of hundreds of thousands of rockets and missiles against the state of Israel? I think that what is now that we are being tested on, and that is not the actual capability, decisive victory of the army, and that's been happening for a long time, but rather the resilience of our state, of our people. And so basically they understood that that is the soft belly, and that is actually being impacted by various steps that we've been taking. But after all, this is what brought us to Oslo. If we're talking about all those that were killed in Lebanon, actually caused us to unilaterally actually withdraw from Lebanon, and because of this pressure being wielded on us through terror incidents. And it was very difficult to ground and accept it. After all, in the 90s, there were doubts about whether our society will really sort of mobilize, will our reserves actually immediately mobilize. I actually was responsible, the commander of the facility that was training the reserves, and I said that these issues are not relevant, these doubts, because I know our people and they will. But the question is how they perceive us, and that actually, in the Pillar of Defense campaign, they thought and they told each other that we are withdrawing. That is what is happening. Suddenly they saw that no, this society is shaking itself up, and it is going to bounce back. And you saw the soldiers and their parents and their spouses, and there was a struggle amongst the units because there were more people who turned up than were even actually mobilized. Units that weren't called up immediately came and knocked on our doors and said, hey, we want to. And that was actually an exhibition of our strength even before the first bullet was shot. So basically, we have been hardened because of this, and they are more resilient, and they have shown they're resilient. In 91, people actually tried to run away from Tel Aviv, but in Protect Cast led, there were sort of breaks, and then life continued. The economy wasn't even detrimentally affected. I think this kind of social resilience, helping the various, God forbid, the bereaved families, but helping out and assisting the soldiers, there was an enormous broadcasting of our force. but from that moment that we actually knew how we can uphold and sort of withstand these kind of situations, we were hoping that this would sort of would give a kind of tailwind. So therefore, I think that the Israeli society has proven it time and time again. Unfortunately, it will be yet having to stand those tests in the future too. But Professor Arens, I think we can say that we will try and supply the ammunition to be able to do it, but I believe that we will be able to withhold and we will prevail. Professor Arens, if you were Ministry of Defense nowadays, in the light of all these threats that were described by you and by Lieutenant General Ya'alon, what in fact would you say are the central focal points that you would actually underpin so that the State of Israel would be best prepared for any scenario?
Yeah.
I assume that we're doing everything that needs to be done in order to be ready. And I think that today, more than in the past, there is awareness of the enormity of the risk. I believe that we have solidarity and that the home front would be able to withstand any threat, but I don't want to test that. What happened in the Gulf War, 39 missiles were fired at us, only 5 landed in populated areas, and also what happened with Hamas and Gaza, I would say that that is a very small dimension compared to what could be. And our goal needs to be to prevent that from happening. So as I said earlier, intercepting missiles, the Air Force, intelligence, the actions aimed at preventing intensification of the conflict. As I said, to a certain extent, it's a bit late. That system already exists. We don't want it to become even stronger, but it exists. And that's the problem that we are facing. And I would just like to hope, I'm not familiar with everything that's going on these days, but I want to believe that the army is aware of the threat and that our intelligence works, so we will know we will be able in time to intercept any threat so that they can be destroyed already on the first day. I don't know if that's something that is attainable, but as quickly as possible in order to refrain from the need to have to trust our solidarity and the strength of the home fronts, so we don't have to get there. If the goal is, in fact, to try as far as possible to prevent a war from happening, whether by deterrence or by other means, Lieutenant General Ya'alon, what can the State of Israel do so that that war or threat of war that is hovering at this time be prevented? First of all, it's being done, and not just now or last year, it's being done. It's called the war between the wars. And in that context, you don't allow entities in the environment to become stronger. Take Gaza, for example. Iran smuggled arms in for a long time, from Iran to Sudan, from Sudan to Egypt, Sinai, up to the Gaza Strip. And since the ship that we intercepted in the Red Sea, that access no longer exists. And the Sudanese and the Egyptians and the capabilities of the the IDF, we don't make everything public, and we do whatever it takes so that Iranian arms don't reach Gaza. Same is true of Lebanon and Syria. They're trying to challenge us, and when we undermine their capability, you are preventing or at least postponing the next round. But when I look at the bigger picture, one of the things that I learned about preparedness is not just what you're doing today, but what you're going to do in a year's time, in 3 years, and 5 years. There's a conceptual limitation that we tend to prepare always for the previous war. That's one of the most important challenges I saw both as Chief of Staff and as Defense Mayor, because in our history, without getting into specific examples, there were too many cases and examples of when we prepare for the previous war, especially in a country like ours. It is always under threat, and the environment is constantly changing geopolitically and in terms of the type of threats and missiles and rockets and terror. Iran's in Syria, not in Syria. Everything's constantly in flux. And in military terms, we are a technological superpower, and technology is also constantly changing. So what do you choose from the available technology for your strategic concept so that next time you'll already get there with a very important edge? And I think we have acquired that kind of experience, but we must not rest on our laurels. In order to prepare for the future challenge, there are a number of principles to bear in mind. First of all, the best defense is always an offense. It's true that in some cases you have to put up a fence and an obstacle, and you have to address the population that has to protect itself against missiles, and we've improved in that too. In the Gulf War, there were 6 areas when they shot a missile to Dimona, and when they did, they went into the shelters in Eilat too. But today it's much more pinpointed and specific, and this enables a continued routine. And then we have this active defense system where we have the Iron Dome and the David Sling and all the other, but ultimately the best defense is a good offense, as they say. And when we're talking about offense, I put a lot of effort into versatile and generic means. When you can identify what's going on, that some people feel exposed. If I were an Iranian in Syria, I would say, what the hell? Those Jews know everything. Here I try to do something, there I'm trying to think. That is an intelligence superiority that's based on technology. The second thing is the ability to transmit or convey the intelligence in real time to the operational level or political level to make the decisions. That's not self-evident. I remember myself as a commander in the first Lebanon war, so I got aerial photographs of the Syrian from the previous day. Today, you get the information in real time, and so then you have the ability with precision fire to deal with it. That's very important. The intelligence superiority, command and control superiority, precision fire, that's a lot. Of course, it's not just the kinetic. There's a whole new world we need to invest in, and we are. And in that sense, we are indeed a cyber power. Cyber has become a whole battlefield of its own. There's a war going on all the time right now, too. But it has opportunities to attack and for intelligence. And of course, it requires us to constantly defend ourselves. So in terms of investment and priorities, first of all, the offensive units, and then your active defense, and then passive defense, and kinetic and cyber. Those are the directions in which we have to come with a huge advantage already for the next round. I'd like to add something, if I may. I suggest that we be realistic. To prevent a war is a worthy cause. We don't want wars. But at the same time, I think it's clear that those actions that we take against Iranian and Syrian targets in Syria, Iranian targets in Syria, their purpose is we know that those actions could possibly trigger a war, and we take those actions knowing that. Because if we allow the number of missiles to grow and to be deployed throughout Syria and Lebanon and to be reinforced by the Iranians, next time it could be even worse, much more dangerous. And therefore, I think that consciously, if we're realistic, I think we know that in the recent months, we have to take into account that there could be a conflagration here. We're prepared for it, but that possibility exists, and we have to be prepared for it. In order to conclude on a more optimistic note, Major General Yalon, do you see any positive aspects in the geostrategic situation in the Middle East, the Sunnis, Saudi Arabia? Perhaps there are some points of light to conclude this session. One of the most significant changes in the Middle East is the result of the regional earthquake. I never called it an Arab Spring, and I don't call it an Islamic winter. And in this reality, it turns out that we and the Sunni Arab camp are in the same boat. Those who still use the term Israeli-Arab conflict, you're completely out of date. There is no Israeli-Arab conflict at this time. It's not just with those countries with whom we signed agreements. Egypt, and before that, Jordan. We had a strategic agreement with Jordan already in 1970. I'm not looking for the ceremonies or agreements drafted by attorneys. I'm looking for shared interests, and that has brought the Sunni Arab camp led by Saudi Arabia and certain countries in Africa, and of course Egypt and Jordan, to be in the same boat with us as a result of shared interests. For them, Iran is the number one threat. It's the Shia versus the Sunni. The jihadists are a challenge for all of us. The Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas, they're an internal enemy in Egypt and in other places. And they don't like the Turkish aspiration for some kind of Muslim hegemony, a rebirth of the Ottoman Empire. This gives very fertile ground for collaboration. Of course, we'd like to see normalization, but here we need to calibrate our expectations. But we're seeing some signs. Air India, for example, is now taking off from Ben Gurion Airport and flying over Saudi Arabia on the way to India. And I expect other developments. And we have to engage in a foreign policy that is realistic, realpolitik, that is based on interests, beyond the fact that we have to carry a big stick in the Middle East, otherwise you don't survive. But we have a lot to offer the countries of the region, not only in terms of security, but in terms of agriculture, economy, water, a lot of things that we've developed here that are a source of pride, but also of power, both in terms of security, economy, and politics. Professor Arens, would you like to sum up the panel? The main point of light, in my opinion, is the strength of the State of Israel, the strength of our army, Air Force. I think I would not be exaggerating if I say it's the best Air Force in the world. And of course, so the current cooperation with certain rulers and leaders in Saudi Arabia and Egypt and their willingness to cooperate with us. This is, of course, first of all, a result of their appreciation for our capabilities. Without that appreciation, I don't think that collaboration would exist either. And therefore, the point of light is that we are a power. We can say that we are an important power in the Middle East, and that is what is leading us and will lead us on. I think we've tried to review in this session the various perspectives on the threats to the State of Israel, and I think that The solutions have also been provided here as Israel has been building them over many decades based on the accumulating experience of previous wars. I think we heard a consensus here that the IDF is preparing for the war of the future and not, as often happens, and in some claim, that it prepares for yesterday's wars. And I think that at the same time, the reality of the Middle East, since 2011, I'm cautious to use the term Arab Spring too, but since the Middle East is in a state of constant events, the rate of change that we are seeing, and we haven't touched on some very, very major geostrategic changes, such as the entry of Russia into Syria, not only as in an advisory capacity, but whether we like it or not, this imposes severe restrictions on Israel's room to maneuver. And on the other hand, our ally, the United States, whom we need so much at this time in this region, and we'll have to wait for this evening to hear where we are going, at least on this very central subject. Will the U.S. cancel the agreement, change the agreement, or perhaps do nothing? And with those question marks, and on an optimistic note that there are also points of light, and the best strategy is to prevent the future war, I'd like to thank Professor Arens and Major General Moshe Bogie.